Loads has happened in the last 2 weeks, but today I want to cover 4 topics in particular, which are elections, the environment, health, and corruption. So let's start with elections, where the Republicans are trying to help their chances in the midterms. So Trump has a long-standing voting bill called the Save America Act, which would require voters to show original citizenship documents like a passport or a birth certificate in person every time they register or update their registration to vote. Now, research from the Brennan Center for Justice found that more than 21 million Americans, legal voters, do not have ready access to those documents. The SAVE Act has already failed in the Senate. It got 50 votes, which is much less than the 60 votes needed to overcome a filibuster. So instead, Trump has been trying to force it through by attaching it to things that have nothing to do with voting. First, he said he wouldn't sign a renewal of FISA, which is a foreign surveillance law, unless the SAVE Act was attached to it. FISA actually lapsed as a result, which is the first time that's happened in almost 20 years. And then last week, Trump cancelled the signing of a separate bill, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, which is a bipartisan housing affordability bill that passed the House 358 to 32. Now, Trump said he wouldn't sign it until the SAVE Act passes. Now, because that housing bill passed by such large margins, it will actually become law automatically after 10 days. So Trump doesn't need to sign it, and his refusal was more performative, but it still tells you a lot about what matters to him and what he's prepared to sacrifice to get this SAVE Act passed. Second is mail-in voting. So Trump posted on Truth Social this week that we should stop Utah from moving to all-mail ballots, warning that it would help Democrats. It wouldn't, particularly. This took Utah's own Republican lieutenant governor, who runs the state elections, by surprise. She pointed out that over 90% of Utah voters of both parties already vote by mail. And she also said, Trump's voted by mail and the system works. But nonetheless, Trump has been obsessed with stopping mail-in voting for years and seems determined to make it harder to vote. Regardless, the administration is already trying to stop people mail-in voting with the support of the US Postal Service. So Postmaster General David Steiner told the Senate last week that under a proposed new rule, the Postal Service just won't deliver mail ballots to states that refuse to hand over their voter data to the federal government. So all 47 Democratic senators have written to the Postal Service calling this an illegal attempt to turn the Postal Service into an arm of the White House. Third is the kind of actions around manufacturing fraud where there isn't any. So after California's primary elections, vote counting took quite a long time, which is completely normal under California's mail ballot rules. Now, Trump claimed without any evidence that Democrats were trying to steal the election. A Trump-appointed federal prosecutor in Los Angeles then opened multiple election fraud investigations. Now, Republican candidate Steve Hilton initially appeared to be losing the governor's race. Trump said at the time that the election was being stolen. Then Hilton ended up advancing to the general election after all, and Trump's response wasn't to say he was wrong. He said the only reason that Hilton had passed through is because Trump had pressured the prosecutor. So in Trump's telling, if a Republican loses, the election was rigged. If a Republican wins, that's also proof the election was rigged because Trump's own intervention supposedly forced the result. So either way, he's convinced elections are rigged. And finally, Trump is kind of testing his message for the November midterms. So after progressive Democratic Socialist candidates won big primaries in New York last week, Trump called the Democrats godless communists who pose a threat to Christianity and the greatest threat to our country since its founding 250 years ago. None of the winning candidates are actually communists, they're Democratic Socialists, which is a different thing. And they're certainly not representative of the Democrat Party in other states, but the rhetoric is kind of the point. What he's trying to do is make the election about painting your opponents as an existential threat and the enemy rather than about his own record. So next, on to the environment. The Department of the Interior has agreed to pay $765 million to a company called Invenergy to cancel 4 offshore wind leases of New York, Maine, and California. Instead, the company will redirect that money into gas plants and geothermal projects. This brings the total the administration has now paid out to cancel offshore wind leases to more than $2.5 billion. One environmental group estimated that the cancelled projects could have powered more than 3 million homes in the US. At the same time, the Department of the Interior has proposed rolling back 2 rules that govern drilling on public lands. One rule change will cut the bond that oil and gas companies have to pay before drilling from $500,000 down to just $25,000. Now, that bond exists to make sure that companies, not taxpayers, pay to clean up old wells when they're abandoned. The other rule change would scrap a requirement for companies to plan how they'll limit methane leaks. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And now moving on to health. RFK Jr., the health secretary, fired all the independent experts on the Centre for Disease Control's Vaccine Advisory Committee, ACIP, last summer, and he replaced them with vaccine skeptics. That new committee then recommended slashing the childhood vaccine schedule. A federal judge ruled in March that the new appointees were distinctly unqualified and blocked the changes. But instead of accepting that, RFK has now rewritten the charter, which is essentially the rulebook, for who's allowed to sit on that committee. The old rules required real expertise in vaccine research and safety, but the new rules just require a balanced range of scientific, clinical, and public health expertise. And basically, critics are saying that's so vague that it can qualify almost anyone with any kind of health adjacent title. One expert called it retrofitting the rules to fit the people. The administration is separately appealing the original court ruling blocking the appointments. And then Trump has created a special refugee program for white South Africans, the Afrikaners, based on his unproven claims of persecutions in South Africa. They're pretty much now the only people getting into the US under asylum. So what's that got to do with health? Well, this week, the US confirmed it's ending all PEPFAR funding for HIV treatment in South Africa, which is about $400 million a year. And officials have tied that decision in part to the same kind of allegations of discrimination against Afrikaners. Now, South Africa has the largest HIV positive population in the world, more than 8 million people. And the head of UNAIDS warned that this kind of cut will cost lives. And finally, the administration has put new conditions on federal health funding. So programs that get federal money now have to prioritize what's described as parental authority in education and move away from harm reduction approaches to drug overdose prevention. So those kind of approaches include things like fentanyl test strips and safe consumption support, which actually have a really strong evidence base for saving people's lives. And this kind of move echoes a theme from a couple of weeks ago when I covered the administration dismantling the housing first approach to homelessness in favour of treatment-focused, less funded alternatives. So basically what the government is doing is it's moving away from really good evidence-based programs in favour of others based purely on ideology. And finally, corruption and 3 different flavours of it. The last 2 weeks have seen corruption in business, pet projects and personal favours. First, business interests. The Justice Department has asked the federal court to dismiss a lawsuit brought by the NAACP against Elon Musk's company XAI. So the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, and it says that XAI is illegally running dozens of gas turbines without pollution permits near homes, schools and churches in a majority black area outside Memphis, Tennessee. The DOJ says shutting the turbines down would threaten national security, and this is why it says the federal court should dismiss the lawsuit. But it's worth noting that Musk is also a key ally of the Trump White House. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the National Park Service gave a $1.7 million no-bid contract to clean the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool to a company owned by a long-time Trump donor, and this bypassed the usual kind of competitive bidding process for these sorts of contracts. As it happened, the renovation didn't go well. The pool turned bright green within days, and the new blue paint on the floor is already peeling. And in Kazakhstan, Trump's 2 sons invested in a company that shortly afterwards was awarded access to a major tungsten mining project, backed up by up to $1.6 billion in US government financing. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick personally helped broker the deal, and Lutnick's son's investment firm separately earned fees helping raise capital for the same group of investors. The New York Times found that one or both families now have financial ties to at least 14 companies working on federal mining deals. Then the UN-sanctioned Board of Peace, which was set up by Donald Trump earlier this year to reconstruct Gaza, is planning a sweeping grant of legal immunity for itself, according to a draft of the resolution obtained by The Guardian. The draft language would also let the organisation obtain public property in Gaza free of charge. Second is taking money for personal projects. So the administration has redirected $352 million in federal funds that were meant to be for the Secret Service towards Trump's White House ballroom project. And this is despite Trump repeatedly promising that the ballroom would be paid for entirely by private donations. And third is about helping supporters escape consequences. So, a private equity executive called David Gentile was convicted of a $1.6 billion fraud scheme that mostly hit ordinary retirement savers. Now, Gentile served less than 2 weeks of a 7-year sentence before Trump commuted it. Federal prosecutors then opened an investigation into how that commutation happened and found communications from jail in which Gentile discussed paying over $2.5 million to people who could help get him released, including a retired priest who was friends with Trump. Trump personally called that priest to ask if he'd been paid, and shortly afterwards the priest was a guest at the White House for Easter lunch. Now that investigation has been shut down by the White House. Separately, Trump has nominated a tax lawyer to be the Inland Revenue Service's top lawyer, but his nominee just happens to work for the law firm that represents Trump's personal holding company. So that's it for this week. All of these stories with sources are on trumpactiontracker.info. See you in a week or two.